Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday right here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson, coming up on today's programme. In a reversal of policy, Ukraine is given the go-ahead to strike Russia using US-made missiles. That's raising concerns about further escalation. President-elect Donald Trump has been accused of selecting so-called disruptors to lead his incoming cabinet. His son, Donald Trump Jr., is quick to defend him, saying, "We know who the good guys and the bad guys are." And a World Bank report estimates that damage inflicted on Lebanon carries a cost of at least $8.5 billion so far, even as diplomatic efforts continue for a ceasefire. Hello and welcome to the programme. The Kremlin says that any US decision to allow Ukraine to fire American missiles deep into Russia would mean it was directly involved in the conflict. While responding to Biden's latest decision, Moscow has accused the administration of escalating the ongoing conflict. While Russian officials have issued repeated warnings claiming that the West is, quote, playing with fire by testing the boundaries of what a nuclear power like Russia is willing to tolerate. This is what the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov had to say.
If such a decision has been made and conveyed to the Kyiv regime, then this means a qualitatively new round of the escalation of tension. This is also a qualitatively new situation from the standpoint of US involvement in this conflict.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by Boris Volodarsky, who's an intelligence historian and former captain in Russia's special forces, the GRU Spetsnaz. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Warnings have been issued by Moscow. We've had one Russian senator by the name of Vladimir Jabarov calling this an unprecedented step towards World War III. Are we really on the brink of World War III, do you think?
I don't think so. And speaking about Jabarov, I guess he's the former general of the KGB, of the FSB, and particularly of its economic department, heavily involved in corruption, as far as I remember. So whatever he says is absolutely relevant.
But do you think Mr. Putin might be considering options, including a nuclear option, hence all this discussion about World War III, which, by the way, isn't just coming from Moscow. We've also been hearing it from various places in Washington as well.
I don't think Putin is interested in considering any nuclear options, because whatever they say, I guess everyone should ignore, especially in the West. It's their way trying to stop the West's involvement in the Ukrainian war. And they have succeeded that in the past 1,000 days, almost 1,000 days, in the past 3 years. And the escalation of the war came from the Russian side, as they're heavily bombing Ukrainian cities using all kinds of missiles, drones, and all that sort of things to completely destroy Ukraine. So any talk about Western involvement is just senseless, and it's empty talk.
But we've been hearing Moscow saying words to the effect that NATO is pretty much now directly in conflict, in confrontation with Russia. Is that really how you see things right now?
Well, the West is not sufficiently in confrontation with Russia, to my opinion, because that should have happened in February 2022, when Russia attacked Ukraine exactly as Hitler did with Russia in 1941. And the West was absolutely silent since that time. And all supplies to Ukraine were more or less to carry on the conflict and not to end it. Because if the United States spent more money and helped Ukraine more and gave allowance to use missiles supplied by the US against Russia, the conflict would probably end long before. And we won't have so many victims on the Ukrainian and even on the Russian side as well.
But we're hearing as well, for example, Dmitry Peskov saying that the United States is pouring fuel on the fire. I mean, clearly they're extremely angry by this decision to allow Ukraine to use this type of weaponry against Russia. I mean, how much of a game changer do you think this decision could end up being?
I don't think there's going to be any game change at all. They were drawing their red lines earlier. They've been doing it all the time, and every time there's a new step on behalf of America, of the United States. It's just no reaction at all. So I think whatever Peskov is saying, one should ignore completely.
Okay, so you're not concerned about any further escalation as a result of this decision by the United States and I should add, the outgoing President Joe Biden?
Absolutely not. I am just only thinking about escalation coming from the Russian side, which is absolutely intolerable and should be stopped as quick as possible.
Do you think there may be some thinking on the part of the Biden administration that this is a way of giving Ukraine a little bit more leverage ahead of what look like fairly inevitable negotiations or peace talks at a later date?
I think that should have happened a long time ago. I don't think today that's going to give a lot of advantages to Ukraine, although that will help in a way. But as far as I know, we're talking about the distance, the ATACMS distance of about 190 miles, which is definitely not enough. There should be far, far longer distance, and there should be far better weapons supplied, and it should have been done before, not today, because they did the Biden administration. They were preferring all the time the appeasement theory, and they were just trying to play game with Putin, and Putin is not a person to play games with.
Why do you say that? Because he's unpredictable, or he may retaliate in an unexpected way? What's the thinking?
He's perfectly predictable, and we know his aims. It is exactly like what happened in the 30s and the 40s with Hitler, who produced his Mein Kampf book, where he wrote exactly what he was going to do. And with Putin, he announced many times what he was going to do, to destroy Ukraine completely, to make it part of Russia, and then start doing the same with the rest of the former Warsaw Pact countries. That is, to come to Germany, take East Germany, to conquer Poland, Baltic republics, Moldavia, and all the rest. His plans are laid out very clearly, and we know what they want. And when somebody is talking about peaceful talks, I'm really all the time surprised, because the peaceful talks are the total elimination of Ukraine and return to with the NATO, return to the situation of 1991.
Aren't the negotiated settlements more focused on the idea that perhaps Ukraine will have to make some concessions? But I mean, are people really saying that Ukraine would cease to exist as a result of a negotiated settlement here?
Well, Ukraine will not cease to exist as a result of any activity of the United States or other countries. They will start guerrilla war, quite definitely, but they will fight for their independence, and at the end they will win. It's happened always in history.
Donald Trump will be the US president in just over 2 months from now. How do you rate his chances of ending this conflict? And do you think he has something new to bring to the table?
I don't think he has any chance at all to end this conflict. And Russia will definitely not listen to what he's going to say. And at one moment when he starts pressing, and he will probably do it for his electorate, because one of his principal moments in his election campaign was that he was going to end the conflict in Ukraine in 3 days, or he said, or 24 hours, or whatever he said. That was all just empty talk. And of course, Russia will not listen to him. And at one moment, if he tries to push harder, which I don't think he would going to do, they will just tell him buzz off, and that will be all.
A lot is being reported about North Korean involvement in this conflict in Ukraine now. I just want to get your thoughts on that. And do you think it's fair to say that by Russian logic, if the United States is in direct confrontation with Russia now, by virtue of its assistance to Ukraine, is North Korea therefore in direct confrontation with NATO?
North Korea has always been in direct confrontation with NATO. And Kim was always threatening the world, and specifically the United States, with the nuclear attack. And all talks that Trump previously, in his previous terms, wanted to do with North Korea ended in complete failure. And of course, Kim was not going to listen to what Trump is saying. For him, contacts and collaboration with Russia is, of course, to a great advantage because his nuclear arsenal will be hugely improved by Russian technologies. And he must send 100,000 people or more because for him, it doesn't matter how many of his soldiers die in this war. Whatever matters for him is his own situation, his own position, and the better arms of his country. So whatever they are saying about escalation, confrontation, that really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because Russia is doing what they want, irrespective of what the world is thinking. They left all agreements, all negotiations, they signed during the past 30 or 40 or 50 years, and they are just not caring about what the world is saying. So why should the Western world care about what the Russians are saying today?
Just lastly, I mean, do you think it's fair to say that the fact that North Korea's help is being enlisted here is a sign of desperation on the part of Moscow, manpower and weaponry said to be in short supply? Do you think that's the reason why they've got the North Koreans involved?
That's one of the reasons. The second reason, the second action of them is to work with Iran. So they got supplies from Iran, they get supplies from North Korea. Their military situation is very bad. As far as I have heard, they're using very obsolete weapons very often. They have tanks in the field, and they were found many times by Ukrainian reporters, by Western reporters. They're using wartime, Second World War time tanks and all that other weaponry. So they're running out of weapons. They have no technology to improve them. They have not enough money and possibilities to produce more arms. So they're taking from whenever they can. This is one of the reasons why they apply to North Korea.
Okay, well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. Boris Volodarsky, really appreciate your time. Now, November the 19th marks a grim milestone, 1,000 days since the onset of the Russia-Ukraine war. Well, the conflict began with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine back in February 2022, and now, as the war enters its third year, Kyiv's forces are facing intensifying pressure. Well, on the streets of central Kyiv, locals say that Biden's latest decision that allows the use of American missiles to strike against targets in Russia could provide a much-needed boost. However, some feel the move has come too late.
To say that this is very timely wouldn't be true, but perhaps it is a preventative action against Trump. Biden has less than 2 months left, and he's trying to do all he can to leave a good legacy. This is good. I guess that it will help us in the future, but I don't think that this will be solved by weapons alone. It may mean additional points for him from his American voters, but for Ukrainians, this is a little too late.
We must defend ourselves. They are striking us while we cannot. It is horrible and it is strange. His permission is just words. Let's see what it means in reality. We have not seen any missile flying deep into Russia. Once we see it, then it will mean that he gave us permission. For now, it's just words.
Well, let's get some more analysis now, and we can speak to Solomiia Bobrovska, Ukrainian MP, who joins us now from Kyiv. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. We're hearing about this decision by the Biden administration to allow Kyiv to use that US weaponry inside Russia. A lot of anger, some reaction even from Washington, talk of World War III. What do you make of this talk of a major escalation?
You know, yesterday when we heard this news, and President Zelensky even couldn't confirm in his evening daily speech to Ukrainians that he cannot confirm that we have the permission. That's the first of all, and the second one, that's about the permission to use the ATACMS only for Kursk direction, and that's, you know, it sounds very cruelty or jeer, you know, to Ukrainians, because you see how the people are just dying, and especially after the last couple very intensive and horrible missile attack on Ukraine. And just the day before yesterday, we had 120 missiles plus 90 Shahed drones attack. It was combined attack on Ukraine after, by the way, when Scholz called to Putin. and it sounds really weird and very politically masked. I would say that's Biden's news, and I don't want to hear just the words. We want to see ATACMS working on at least somewhere. But the problem is whether how many missiles we'll get the first time, the second one, the distance of these missiles on which we can use that, and the third one, that's Storm Shadow, British Storm Shadow permission, and Scalp from French and Taurus from German. So it sounds like it's saying yes, but in reality, no.
Do you think that explains the reaction from your president, Volodymyr Zelensky, who, to quote him, said, the missiles will speak for themselves, strikes are not carried out with words? I mean, that doesn't sound very enthusiastic, does it? And do you think that he thinks this is perhaps too much of a hollow promise?
Yes, that's why I'm trying to explain that within Ukrainian society and even with Ukrainian members of parliament, we do not understand till the end whether we got this permission for ATACMS or not, whether it will work or not, or it will work only for months and then after Trump's inauguration it will stop. Because we see the reaction of some Republicans now in Congress, and whether it will be working only, we can use the ATACMS only on Kursk direction because of the Northern Korean troops, or we can use it widely on the whole front line. That's why Zelensky said as he said, and that's why even we don't understand. So it's a political part of American political game. It's a political some political message for Ukrainians, or if this formula actually can work at all, we still do not understand. That's why he said we will see when ATACMS will work, but not on the words. In the news, when the White House didn't have this for the last night, the real message to Ukraine. In an official news. Only today in the morning in Ukraine, according to Kyiv time, we heard, so we can use it only on Kursk direction because of the North Korean troops. But again, so many questions are and appears, and at the same time, we don't see the position of UK, France, and Germany as well.
Okay, so it sounds like Ukraine is feeling somewhat abandoned at this moment by its allies. Just going back to the reaction, though, from not just the Russians who are saying this is an unprecedented step towards World War III. Donald Trump's own son said that he believes that President Biden's trying to lead the United States towards World War III before his father takes office. What do you make of the fact that this talk of World War III is being used not just by Moscow, but by the incoming administration, well, someone related to the incoming administration in the United States as well?
You know, to be honest, we're sick and tired of these words. And yesterday, Ukrainians, by the way, after this combined huge attack, as we treat this all with humor now, all this serious political statements. Some of my colleagues made the postcard. Today is a day of escalation with the kitten, you know, and flowers. That's how to mark the escalation day when according to the Biden's logic, we can use the ATACMS, or according to our partner's allies' logic, we can use ATACMS and finally to resist Russians. You know, we've heard this statements about the escalation and World War III since 24th of February. Don't resist, because it will start the Third World War. We will not give you tanks because it will be the beginning of escalation, and Russia will move to Baltics and Poland. We will not give you F-16, the oldest version of the fly jets, because Russians will treat this escalation. We will not say yes to NATO because Russia will be angry, and so on. That's an endless story of different points, you know, and issues, and that's an endless list, it seems to me, for Ukraine. When we have to hear from the partners, it will be the escalation day, the World War III, and so on, so on. What are the arguments except their emotions, or what are the arguments except their not willingness to finally to help and support Ukraine until the victory, but not as they like to say, we want Ukraine to win, but not Russia not to lose. That's the whole problem in the very basic things. Not Russia to lose, but it's impossible with Ukrainian victory if they really want Ukraine to win.
I mean, it sounds like you think a lot of mistakes have been made along the way, strategic errors on the part of Ukraine's allies. But let's just focus on how things unfold from here. 65 days or so left of the Biden administration, a new president coming into the White House. I'm just wondering what you think that's going to change and whether you think Donald Trump will and can end this war.
I'm afraid he can make lots of mistakes. And again, it can be negotiations or freezing the war in a very sharp methods, sharp and rapid methods. But the only thing they have to understand that there is Trump, there is Zelensky, there is Putin, Putin who doesn't want so far to listen to anyone because he is on a very successful position and he's doing success on the front and in Ukraine as well. If we are looking up to the front map. That's the first point. The second one, there is Ukrainian society, which will say its final word, yes or no, because that's about Ukrainians who stand 3 days, then a week, and then 1,000 day resisting Russia. And you know, sometimes it's impossible to press on Ukrainians because it's just impossible. We are to decide what we're gonna do. We'll freeze or we'll start negotiating or whatever. But that's the very dangerous bell, ringing a bell for Europe, that if Trump will say no to Ukraine, no to NATO as the whole security system, someone from the European leaders has to take leadership to take care of security and defense in Europe. If US will start their independent politics on this issue.
But do you think Europe can fill the void if the United States says over to Europe, it's not our problem? Can Europe fill that void left behind by the United States?
I would say it could be very unpredictable. There are dozens of plans, ABC, which Europe has to count with the Trump administration. And why not? We hear his statements. And Europe actually hears what is he doing and saying. So I think they have to be ready with all plans on the table to be prepared for. And that's what we tried always to explain for Europeans. We want time for your building military productions and capacities. And that's if you are not capable to produce as much as Russia is doing now for this 2.5 years, when Russia increased their production in missiles, ballistic missiles, rockets, Shaheds, and so on. And Europe, just with the US even with together, they're just increasing and still not on the same line. I think that's the huge problem, not only for Ukraine, that's our war, but for European security as well. And unfortunately, it's not even the bell from Russia, it's the choir with the bells from Russia. And now it's only the bell from the US side for now.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Solomiia Bobrovska, Ukrainian MP. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, the first Ukrainian strikes could happen in the coming days and are likely to be carried out using ATACMS rockets, which have a range of more than 300 kilometers or 190 miles. Well, in the European Union, Annalena Baerbock, Germany's foreign minister, has said that Biden's U-turn was important, and she cautioned that it should not be seen as a rethink of the Western efforts. Instead, quote, as an intensification of what has already been delivered. Well, for more, we're joined now by William Alberque, who is former director of NATO Arms Control, Disarmament and Weapons of Mass Destruction Non-Proliferation Center. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. What do you think is the significance of this announcement by the United States, and how much of a difference do you think this is all going to make?
I think it's a very significant development, both politically, just because it shows that the United States is going to lead the way in allowing Ukraine to take the fight more onto Russian territory. But militarily, this is very significant because as you mentioned, the ATACMS artillery system, these are rockets that can go much further into Russian territory. So essentially what Russia has done by, with the West banning Ukraine from being able to use these on Russian territory, Russia has been able to concentrate forces, logistics, command centers, artillery depots, etc., on Russian territory. Now these sites will be vulnerable to Ukrainian artillery strikes, which again means Russia's going to have to rethink where it's storing these. It had been safe on Russian territory. Now, nowhere on Russian territory within 300 miles or 300 kilometers of the border is going to be safe.
So how do you think these weapons could be used, and specifically on what sorts of targets?
These are very highly accurate rockets that are fired from the HIMARS system. And so these systems are mobile. They can set up very quickly. They can fire very accurately deep into Russian territory. So the primary targets are going to be Russian command centers, Russian depots for fuel and ammunition. And so what this is going to do is it's going to disrupt Russia's ability to command its forces near Ukrainian territory, and it's going to force Russia to push its logistics and command centers back even further away from the battlefield. And we know from the way Russia fights, they need to have their commanders and their logistics very close to the front line in order to be able to function effectively. So this may disrupt Russia's ability to do things more dynamically. It may slow them down a lot. It may slow down their thinking and their movements considerably.
And with those who are concerned about escalation, I mean, do you think this is a case of the West baiting Russia and therefore putting lives at risk and possibly even putting the specter of nuclear warfare on the table?
I don't think so. I think rather it's the other way around, that Russia has continually tried to use non-credible threats in order to try to inhibit the West from doing what it needs to do to support Ukraine. So throughout the conflict, first it was we couldn't give Ukraine mobile artillery. Then it was we couldn't give them battle tanks. Then it was we couldn't give them aircraft. We couldn't give them HIMARS. Every one of these was said by Russia to be an escalation that would change the nature of the conflict. Every time we've crossed Russia's red lines, nothing has really changed. So I think this is another case of Russia trying to induce fear in the West to prevent the West from doing what Ukraine really needs them to do. And I think that what we'll find is that the nature of the conflict won't change. There's really, I don't think, any credible threat of Russia going further. Attacking the West, for instance, would be suicide, and using nuclear weapons in this conflict is simply not politically or militarily viable for Russia.
So with regards to this idea that this move brings NATO into direct confrontation with Russia, it doesn't sound like you think this has been a massive game changer. Was NATO already in direct confrontation with Russia, therefore, do you think?
I think Russia has been in direct confrontation with NATO for years, and it's the West's lack of willingness to recognize that Russia has been trying to undermine the West, trying to infiltrate, commit sabotage, use chemical weapons in Britain. I mean, Russia has been doing all kinds of incredibly aggressive things against the West for more than a decade. And I think that realization is coming more to the play here. The fact that weapons supplied by NATO countries are going to be used more effectively in Ukraine's fight against Russia is really no change to me. It's just, again, a realization that Ukraine needs to be able to defend itself. We're supplying them with the means to do so, and now we're supplying them with the ability to use them the way that Ukraine believes they need to in order to win this conflict.
But there are just so many people who think that the West has gone too far this time. We've just had the Hungarian foreign minister warning that this war in Ukraine now risks spilling over into a global conflict. That warning came just in the last couple of hours. I mean, it doesn't sound like you agree with what they're saying. It doesn't sound like you think anything particular has changed as a result of developments in the last 24 hours then.
I think that's absolutely correct. I think there is no real change here. And I think once Ukraine starts to use them, I think Russia will complain a little bit more. But I mean, just yesterday, Russia unleashed an attack on Ukraine's energy infrastructure in order to try to freeze its Ukrainian public citizens, to try to deprive them of warmth as they go into the winter. This is a massive escalation and an effort to bring direct suffering to Ukrainian civilians. Had nothing to do with this decision. This is just Russian policy. So what are they going to do that's worse than what they're already doing? They're already targeting civilians. They're already trying to starve Ukraine's population, to freeze them in winter. It beggars belief when people say this is provoking Russia. Russia is in the middle of trying to slaughter Ukrainian civilians. This is not a just war. This is not a rational conflict. And Ukraine needs everything that they can to defend themselves. And I think it's absolutely foolish to say that this is going to push Russia into doing something as crazy as attacking NATO. It simply won't, because it knows that if it did so, it would lose. It's not going to do that. So much respect to the Hungarian minister. I don't think he's being entirely truthful here. I think there's something else behind what he's saying, which has very little to do with Ukraine and its willingness to defend itself.
But it isn't just him. As I said, there are other voices, and we've had Donald Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., and a Russian MP, in fact, using the language of the Third World War. This is what Donald Trump Jr. said. They seem to want World War III before my father has a chance to create peace and save lives. So it's not just coming from the Hungarian foreign minister. I mean, it sounds like everyone is deeply concerned.
Sure. And I mean, to be cautious about escalation is one thing. But again, as I've mentioned, throughout this conflict, Russia has said that they would escalate if we were to supply them with different types of weapons. And we've crossed these red lines and nothing has changed. The fact that a Russian MP says this, well, of course, if you watch the Russian news, and if you've watched them for the past 3 or 4 years, they've been talking about how everything is an escalation and how they should launch nuclear strikes against the United Kingdom, how they need to eradicate the West, how they need to demonstrate nuclear weapons use against the West in order to make us fearful of Russia again. This is part of a much larger Russian narrative where Russia wants to use coercive threats in order to get what it wants. And the fact that it resonates with some people in the West is sad, because when a bully threatens you, you have to stand up to that bully. If you just keep giving in to the bully is going to continue to take more and more and more. And so, with all due respect to everyone who has said that this is an escalation or the brink of World War III, it isn't. It's not. It's not going to cause World War III. We'll see what Trump does. We'll see if Trump can bring peace. And I would welcome if he could bring a just peace for Ukraine in this conflict. But the fact that people are willing to say that this is an escalation does not mean that it actually is.
Yeah, you anticipated my next question, because I wanted to ask you a bit about the incoming Trump administration. And I want to ask you whether you think that NATO is perhaps feeling a little bit vulnerable at the prospect of another Trump presidency.
It's an interesting question, and honestly, the answer is I don't think anyone really knows. There have been statements from people in Trump's orbit that he doesn't like NATO very much. At the same time, when you look at how much the NATO allies were spending on defense in, say, 2014, I think there were 4 allies who were spending 2%, and now there are 23. And so I think Trump himself can take credit for strengthening NATO. And, so he could declare victory and say that NATO has changed because of Trump's policies, and therefore he owns it and that he's very happy about that. But the opposite could happen as well. We simply don't know. And as he brings together his team, some of his team have been very supportive of NATO, some have been very critical of NATO. His choice for the Secretary of Defense is somewhere in between, but has not been an opponent to NATO. So we really have to see how the team completely fills out, whether they're going to get through Senate for approval, and then what policies they try to enact. But so far, I'm cautiously optimistic that Trump, again, could take credit for strengthening NATO during his time as president.
And when it comes to ending this particular conflict with Ukraine, obviously he's got a different dynamic to his relationship with President Putin, to the relationship that President Biden has. Do you think he's got what it takes to end this conflict, de-escalate this conflict, and what do you think his approach is going to be?
It'll be really interesting. I mean, every president comes into the White House and says that they're going to resolve our issues with Russia, whether it was Clinton or Bush or Obama or Trump. And at the end of their terms, we still end up in conflict with Russia, because I think the conflict between the United States and Russia is much deeper than personality. In general, I think Trump got along a little bit better with Putin than some presidents have, but fundamentally our interests differ. And I think that will continue no matter what. I think there is more space for Trump to have negotiations with Putin. In general, Republican administrations tend to be more deal-making with our adversaries. So we'll see what's possible. And they do have this long-standing relationship between the two of them. They have talked many times. So I think if you're looking for a stabilization in the US-Russia relationship, I think Trump is probably a pretty good chance of that. But again, we'll see exactly who ends up on his final team and where his priorities lie as well. He may be focused entirely on domestic politics, and he may just want placeholders for international relations, or he may want a big deal with the New START treaty, for instance, lapsing in February 2026. It may be that Trump wants to replace Obama's New START agreement with his own treaty with Russia. So we could see some sort of grand bargain on nuclear weapons. we really don't know. Again, we'll have to see what his priorities are once he gets his team in place and once he starts laying out what he wants to take care of first.
Yeah, and the NATO chief, Mark Rutte, is saying that this conflict in Ukraine isn't just a threat to Ukraine, it's also a threat to US interests. And I'd like to ask you what you think he means by that, and whether you think the Trump administration views it in the same way.
Well, I think what the Secretary General means is that Russia is trying to hit the West where they're weakest and trying to divide us and trying to undermine our confidence and our ability to represent our interests. And so if Ukraine is defeated or seen to be defeated, I think Putin will turn his eye towards the next weakest spots in Europe, in Asia, in Africa. We have to remember that Russia right now is not only invading Ukraine, it is also waging a campaign in Africa to try to bolster different governments there and try to secure long-term resources. He's trying to push the United States out of the Middle East. Russia's longer-term efforts across the world appears to be to create its own coalition against what Russia calls the Anglo-Saxon bloc of countries. If you read their foreign policy, it's very anti-America. It's very anti-Anglo-Saxon, as they put it in their own foreign policy documents. So I think Rutte is correct. Russia has laid out its stall as having a desire to lead an anti-American bloc. And so Ukraine is merely the first step in a much larger plan that Putin has in order to try to represent Russian interests and to push America into a smaller position. So we'll see if the dynamic between Trump and Putin changes that fundamentally, and if Russia changes their foreign policy direction to be more cooperative with the West. We just don't know. But I think Rutte is right saying that Putin so far has set out his stall as an anti-American center of power in the world.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time today. William Alberque.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, President-elect Donald Trump's campaign picks are continuing to send shockwaves through Washington. His choice for Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is denying a sexual assault allegation, while his possible Attorney General pick, Matt Gaetz, is at the center of an ethics scandal, leading some to describe his nominations as disruptors. Well, the controversy doesn't end there. Trump has also nominated Chris Wright as Energy Secretary. That's a climate skeptic who denies the existence of a climate crisis. Well, for more on this, we're joined now by lawyer and Republican strategist Amanda Makki. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. You were recently a volunteer for the election integrity campaign for President-elect Donald Trump. I just want to ask you, first of all, what you make of how Team Trump is shaping up.
Well, I think what we're seeing, it's not a surprise. These are a lot of Trump loyalists, people who have supported President Trump when others in the Republican Party weren't supporting him. These are people who, for the last year and a half to 2 years, have been front and center on our TV screens, defending President Trump and defending his positions. So as it goes in every administration, you reward people who, have been loyal, who have worked hard for you. And certainly that's what we're seeing. But, if you look back to where President Trump was in 2017 when he first came in, he brought in a lot of people who he didn't know. I mean, he certainly didn't know Washington. He was a political outsider. And a lot of those people, he believes, turned on him. And so being skeptical about that, he's going to go for people who he knows are loyal and have proven that. And I think that's what you're seeing with these picks for his cabinet positions.
And what do you make of this label, disruptors? Do you think it's the correct sort of label?
I do. Disruptors, in government terms, and I worked in government for a long time. I started my career as a native Farsi speaker. I worked in the Pentagon just weeks after 9/11. And from there, I went on to work in Congress for a decade as a lawyer. And, having been in and around Washington, I actually grew up there. It's hard to find people who are willing to go against the grain. Certainly, we've never seen that with other presidents where they say, well, I'm going to come in and I'm going to disrupt the apple cart, if you will. And Donald Trump campaigned on that. He campaigned on that before. But now I think even more so, a lot of people say he has a mandate. He's going to go there and shake the trees. And I think you're going to actually see that. I mean, honestly, I think What's emblematic of that and personified in that is Matt Gaetz, Congressman Matt Gaetz, former congressman from Florida, who, doesn't back away, isn't afraid of a camera, and certainly is very smash mouth in his way. He is someone that he wants him to go into the DOJ, which might be the most, I guess, in Trump's view, maybe the worst offender of all the departments and agencies, and the way that, lawfare was handled and what the DOJ has done to him personally, he believes. And so I think having someone like Matt Gaetz go, and even before Matt Gaetz goes there, if he gets there, is to really, show that people are going to leave that building. They're going to leave those positions. If they are not lined eye to eye with President Trump, those lawyers, FBI agents, they're going to be out of there before they let Matt Gaetz fire them.
Indeed, if indeed he gets the job, as you correctly say, if he's nominated. But I just want to ask you a bit more about Gaetz, because of course you're an attorney yourself, and I just wonder whether you have full confidence that Matt Gaetz is the right person for that job.
Well, fortunately, I'm not a United States Senator, so that's not my job. But that is the job of a United States Senator, the role of advice and consent. And they are supposed to pour through all the information and really assess if this is the best person. But, people have to also understand that politics is in play. Whether they like to admit it or not, these United States senators are up for re-election. And as I like to say, people are always about number one, especially people who are in Congress. They want to make sure they don't lose their jobs. And I can assure you that if Matt Gaetz has top cover from President Trump the way it appears that he does, Donald Trump is going to what we call whip for him. He's going to call and make calls to those United States senators, and whether it's him or his surrogates, he's going to have them know that if they don't support his nominees, that he will run a primary candidate against them, just as an example, or that their priority issue, whatever it may be for their state, may be on the chopping block, may not happen if he doesn't get their support for his nominees. So certainly, I think, we've always seen in every administration, there's one cabinet appointee that doesn't make it through. So, that always happens. That's not anything new with this administration or with previous administrations. That's the norm. And so there may be one, but Matt Gaetz, in a way, is very close with President Trump. And I think that he has proven himself in a way that Donald Trump had other options for DOJ attorney generals, and he chose Matt Gaetz. Certainly there were people with more legal skills and years in government and years of service as a lawyer, but he chose Matt Gaetz for a reason, because he is a disruptor.
Okay, so you don't sound worried about that appointment. What about the others? Let's turn our eye to RFK Jr. He says he's going to make America healthy again. Do you think he's going to achieve that goal?
I do. He's someone who's been around government for a long time, being a Kennedy. He's someone who is he's a very smart man. He knows what he knows, and he believes in certain things. He's an interesting pick because he's a Democrat. He certainly is someone who has very different positions that a lot of Republicans do. But he's very anti-industry, and so is Trump. Pharmaceutical industry, for example. I think that's, certainly him and President Trump are aligned on that. And so I think you're just going to see a lot of disruption there. I think there's a lot of concern within the outside broader community of healthcare providers that there's going to be a lot of changes. He is someone who is going to have, I think, both Democrats and Republicans are going to be asking him tough questions because he doesn't really have positions that fall into a box like a typical Republican or a typical Democrat. But he's someone who I believe has the ability to do something that we really need in this country, and that is to go after actually the food products that children are eating and adults are eating too, that are illegal in places like Europe, but they're legal in America. And of course, Fruit Loops being the perfect prime example that you've heard a lot about. But it's going through those types of foods that are illegal in other countries, banned in other countries, yet we consume them here. I think it'll be a breath of fresh air. I think a lot of people are kind of waiting and wanting to see someone who will go in and expose those things, and who better than someone like RFK Jr.
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of people we've spoken to in the last week or so have said that people like him and some of the other picks will look at old problems with a fresh pair of eyes. But we've also spoken to people in the ranks of the Republican Party who aren't altogether happy with some of these appointments. I mean, do you think it's fair to say that the Republican Party isn't universally supportive of all of the names on the list for the incoming administration?
Well, I mean, you're always going to have that. We're not, one-dimensional people, and people are always going to have their views. But you have people like Fetterman and really other members of the Democratic Party that have said, I've worked with Marco Rubio, and Marco Rubio would, be very good at this. So it really all comes down to what all is exposed during those nomination hearings. We've seen hearings go off the rails before, like with Kavanaugh and what the Democrats pulled there. So really, it's the role of the Senate is to bring about everything, discuss everything, and then make a determination of not who is the best, most perfect person in the world for this job. Is this the right person to get the job done right now? And I think that's where you'll see, people like Lindsey Graham, who have supported Democrats in the past. You will have Democrats on the other side of the aisle who will say, this is a person who can do this job. Again, you're not seeking perfection. It's not a 100%. It's someone who can get the job done right at this time. And again, when you have someone like President Trump, who is not ashamed, is not afraid to weigh in and tell these senators, I can make your life a living hell if you don't support it. Now, it's up to the senators. Ultimately, obviously, they have the vote. But again, it is something that President Trump, I believe, will whip on. And that will make a difference, because it will make it hard for senators who are up for re-election, or senators who have priority projects in their states they want to make sure that the president supports.
Yeah, and obviously one of the other appointments we've talked a lot about in the last week or so is Pete Hegseth, the Defense Secretary, who's going to inherit a huge to-do list as he takes up that position, assuming he's confirmed. And specifically with relation to Ukraine, we've been hearing rhetoric, quite frightening rhetoric, use of the word World War III being used by Moscow and by Donald Trump Jr. to describe the situation that could unfold there. I mean, what's your thinking on where things could unfold with regards to Ukraine?
Well, I mean, I would say this about Pete Hegseth. He's someone who is another disruptor. But if you look at, 3 million employees at the Department of Defense, certainly a huge agency as far as numbers are concerned. But, they failed their seven most recent audits, just as an example. And so you really do need someone who's going to go in there. And it doesn't have to be someone who is, served in multiple wars, which, by the way, Pete Hegseth did. He did serve in 2 theaters. So this is someone who is experienced in combat. He's decorated. He's someone who has an Ivy League education. This is someone who can go in there and get things done. A lot of people think that he's the youngest, and though he is young, he is not the youngest. Don Rumsfeld is the youngest DoD secretary to ever serve back in 1975. So we've seen, young people serve before in these roles. And certainly I think that if you look at people in, for example, the current cabinet, I mean, someone like Pete Buttigieg, who is Secretary of the Department of Defense, he's someone who served abroad. He served our nation. He's a veteran. People said, okay, we'll let him be in charge of the Department of Transportation. What's the difference between him and Pete Hegseth? And I think you have to give people the opportunity, again, the United States Senate, give them the opportunity to go through the process to make sure that they go through with a fine-tooth comb everything about these candidates for the position and let them make that decision. Yeah, well,
one difference is, of course, that Donald Trump has said that he can end the conflict in Ukraine within 24 hours of taking office, and that's going to be something that Pete Hegseth feels quite acutely by way of a pressure sort of lingering over him. Do you think they're going to be able to deliver?
I can't say, and I don't think anyone can say, but certainly that's what the president is thinking. That's what he wants to do. And that's something he's going to have to discuss with his advisors. He has key people advising him. They have to make that best decision for America. But look, this isn't different than where Donald Trump's been, for years on his stance and, really wanting to, not be a part of that. So I'm not surprised by it.
So what is the solution, therefore, in your opinion? A negotiated settlement by way during which Ukraine has to give up some of its territory? What do you think is the right answer?
I'm not the right person to ask that question. I'm really, that's not something that's in my wheelhouse. But I believe that, Donald Trump has campaigned on what he's campaigned on, and people voted for him by a wide majority. And so I think let him make that decision. Let him present that to the American people, and let's see where things go. But writing billion-dollar checks to Zelensky, I don't think is what the American people want.
Yeah, and of course the United States is a deeply divided country. I think that came across in the polls. A 50-50 split, and ultimately, the polls turned out to be wrong. But what is clear is that a lot of people won't be happy with the fact that there's a new administration, a new Trump administration on the way. How's Donald Trump going to bring Americans together and unite the country?
Well, look, I think he already has. I mean, you see how many people in the Native American community, in the African American community, in the Hispanic American community, in these communities that are typically not Republican. And I'm not saying they've become Republican, but they've moved towards the conservative values. And so I think they see someone like President Trump as a uniter, someone who's going to be able to bring the country together. And I think that something like what happened to President Trump, where his ear was grazed, he was almost killed on live TV, I think that changes people too. And I think that trauma that he experienced, it's a different perspective on life. And so I think you're going to see a little bit of a different Trump at the 2.0 version, and someone who really is trying to unite the country. And I think that's what you're going to see, a little bit different than Trump 1.0.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Amanda Makki, great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Now, turning our eye to the Middle East. In Lebanon, a cautious calm has settled over the southern suburbs of Beirut as the US envoy is expected to visit the capital to try and secure a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hezbollah. Meanwhile, Hezbollah has confirmed the death of its media relations official, Mohammed Afif, who was killed in an Israeli strike on the Ras al-Nabad neighborhood of Beirut. Well, the party issued a statement describing Afif as being one of the key figures in its media and political operations. Meanwhile, the World Bank has issued a report outlining the cost of this conflict to Lebanon so far. Well, let's find out more about this, and we can speak to Amin Salam, who is Lebanon's Minister of Economy and Trade. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Minister. The World Bank says that the cost of this conflict is now somewhere in the region of $5.1 billion in economic losses, plus at least $3.4 billion worth of structural damage. So we're looking at a combined figure here of about $8.5 billion US dollars. Does that sound right to you?
Well, thanks, Tom, for having me with you. Always a pleasure to join you. Let me start by saying I just returned from Washington 2 days ago after attending the annual meetings of the World Bank, IMF. And we have discussed those numbers thoroughly while we were visiting Washington, attending those meetings. I could tell you very honestly from the Lebanese government perspective as Minister of Economy and Trade, studying, assessing, and looking closely at the negative impact of the war on Lebanon, you can easily double those numbers. The World Bank numbers, based on their surveys, assessments, knowledge on the ground, projects in Lebanon, are very, very close to being accurate. However, I can tell you that if I am looking as Minister of Economy towards the part that is related to the GDP, medium to long term, if I'm looking at the unemployment rate, which is unprecedented, that's now over 50%, looking as well at the major sectors, tourism, and agriculture that are totally destroyed, I can tell you that this 8 billion can be easily doubled. We're looking at over $16 billion in my government's assessment, in the ministry's assessment, including everything. And the reason I say that with a lot of confidence is because I know that there are a lot of elements that the World Bank did not include in their report, not because they did not want to include it, but because they didn't, it was not part of their economic assessment. But it is what we do here, it is what we assess as a government. So adding up all the destruction, let me tell you as well, Tom, that day by day, those numbers are adding up very fast. So daily, you're having mass destruction around the country, and that includes business institutions, that includes hospitals, that includes industries. So the numbers are growing by the day. That's why we are saying that we can easily double up those numbers. And if we keep going without a ceasefire until the end of the year, we're looking at much higher numbers, much higher numbers.
Okay, so you're basically saying that that number is way below the true cost. You also mentioned that certain sectors of the economy have been really severely damaged. You mentioned hospitality and tourism. Clearly no tourists are going to Lebanon at the moment. But are some sectors of the economy managing to remain somewhat resilient in the context of this war? And does that mean that some money is coming into Lebanon's coffers?
Well, as Minister of Economy and Trade, particularly I emphasize on the trade part. So we are monitoring very closely the import-export transactions, operations in the country, and that is the only, I can assure you, that is the only source of income today to the country, to the government. That is the only source of cash flow that is rotating, creating availability of cash in the country, which is the import-export of necessary goods like food supplies, day-to-day needs, everything that is, I mean, all what the people consume on a daily basis, including oil and gas, including most of the necessities, the basics, really. That is what is moving the economic cycle at this point, because the port and airport are still welcoming ships, welcoming airplanes, and the trade lines are still open. However, that remains to be a fear in case Israel decides to escalate and, for example, have a complete siege or siege on our import-export movement.
Yeah, obviously a huge cost to the country, not to mention the human cost as well. And even before this Israeli military operation began, Lebanon's economy has been in a critical condition for about 5 years prior to that. Large sections of the population have been pushed into poverty. I'm just wondering how people are managing to survive. How are people putting food on the table under these conditions?
Well, I can tell you, Tom, it's beyond what anyone can explain. Really, today, what the Lebanese people are passing through is devastating. And whoever tells you that contrary to that is not really describing the situation in the real form or shape that it is in today. The country is devastated. People lost their jobs. As I mentioned earlier, unemployment is at its highest, especially that you have over 1.5 million people today displaced. Out of those 1.5 million people, you have about 600,000 men and women lost their jobs. They have no paycheck. They have no money to put food on the table. They are relying today on the government's assistance. They are relying today on foreign aid, on food coming in airplanes, health aid coming in airplanes, and that's how they are surviving. I mean, there is a certain percentage of people in Lebanon, I would say no more than 20%, that have some reserves. I'm talking about money reserves, have some cash stored in their houses, in their homes, in their safe boxes that they are spending, but that is depleting without new money coming into the country, because most of the businesses today are frozen or closed or destroyed. So it is very difficult. And putting food on the table today is a major, major issue for a lot of people. We're talking millions of people.
I just want to talk about the situation on the ground, the military activity during the course of the weekend. There were fresh strikes on Beirut during the weekend, some of them, by the sounds of things, very intense strikes. And we also received reports that Hezbollah has been firing more projectiles into Israeli territory. I mean, none of this sounds conducive to sort of diplomatic channels and diplomatic paths that people might be considering. We're hearing that progress is being made on the diplomatic front. Nevertheless, what's your understanding of where things stand right now?
Well, in few interviews the past month, I stated very clearly, even before the US elections, and I had numerous meetings on that front in Washington, D.C. during my visit. It has been made very clear to me in a very diplomatic way that there is a serious decision that has been taken. I'm talking on a regional basis to keep this operation going until Israel accomplishes its targets. Now, that means two things. First, the first scenario would be that there will be no ceasefire, no serious diplomatic discussions, even though we're expecting tomorrow or after tomorrow, Amos Hochstein to decide on a visit to Lebanon. But the first scenario would be that there will be no serious ceasefire before President-elect Donald Trump steps into the White House January 20, and he takes the lead on really making things happen, because he promised us while we were visiting Washington, and we were working very closely with him and his team on those future expectations or discussions, and he promised to make it happen. However, today, nothing is different than what we have seen the past year, Tom, of discussions in Gaza, of discussions in Lebanon. We keep going back and forth with changes in conditions, with changes in terms of the 1701 that makes the Lebanese side, a little more aggressive on accepting, like taking it negatively, I mean. So we hope, I can tell you, we hope, because Lebanon cannot tolerate another month of this situation, this escalation, this destruction, and its entire impact on the country. So we hope that there will be at least a beginning of a ceasefire or an entry approval, or a beginning or a preliminary approval for a ceasefire ASAP, because we need it. But I can still tell you that all the discussions about positive messages that we have heard the past 2 days are still not real until we see them happen.
Sure, but I mean, Amos Hochstein doesn't get to Lebanon until tomorrow. And, he has, it would appear, been making some progress behind the scenes. We understand that the Speaker of Parliament, Nabih Berri, has also been working hard on the other side. You don't sound very optimistic that they're going to succeed in striking some sort of a ceasefire deal. Well,
I'm hoping for the best, Tom, and planning for the worst, because I've been monitoring all those visits, again, as I told you, for the past year, and most particularly for the past few months. And I just arrived from Washington, and we've had serious discussions there. And my feeling was that it's not going to be an easy path to a ceasefire. We're hoping that it will happen. We need it to happen. We're working to make it happen, but we have to be realistic. Tomorrow's Amos visit, I mean, I hope it will break the ice. It will create some, as I said, some accessibility to a real discussion for a ceasefire. But still, we have to be very cautious and plan for this to continue until Trump's administration is intact. Trump is in the White House, and then things will be more serious.
Yeah, I just want to ask you, you mentioned there Israel and its objectives in Lebanon. I mean, one of its objectives is to destroy Hezbollah. And just before we crossed to you, we gave the news that Mohammed Afif, one of the latest senior officials in Hezbollah, has been killed. I mean, Hezbollah has been dealt blow after blow. Do you think Israel is now, therefore, close to having achieved its objective of destroying Hezbollah?
Well, to be quite honest, if we're talking about objectives, now I think that Israel has really accomplished. I think what they have accomplished even shocked them. They are surprised as to what they have accomplished so far on the Hezbollah front. But I can tell you, as Minister of Economy, being part of this government, and looking into this, and being someone who has been born within the struggle 45 years ago, I left this country with my parents on the same objectives of Israel, even when Hezbollah was not even existent in Lebanon. So their objectives, in my own opinion, are beyond Hezbollah. There are objectives to have control over the water in Lebanon, have control over more land in Lebanon, the seafront that can secure the oil and gas fields. So there are a lot of objectives. On top of that, there has been a total destruction of the Lebanese economy, Tom. The Lebanese economy has been targeted very badly. And as a responsible minister, I can tell you, to fight Hezbollah, a lot of the destruction did not need to happen. We have major destruction of major infrastructure in Lebanon, major sectors in Lebanon that are long gone, and they would need, a decade to come back.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us once again here on Al Arabiya News. Amin Salam, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.